like to begin with acknowledgement of the Arrernte people. I was with some of them last night. I had my first kangaroo tail last night, so first time to have that. So anyways, we had a nice little gathering last night. So certainly to acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of this land. I learned this when I came to Australia some years ago about acknowledging the custodians of the land. So I do that in the U.S. too, which is it's not so common there, but hopefully they'll get onto it. Just a short prayer as we begin here, using this image from Scripture, from 2 Corinthians, about God's treasure in earthen jars. So in that Scripture passage, we hear that we are clay jars, earthen jars, all of us, and God's light and glory is within our earthen jar. Now, what is our earthen jar? Our earthen jar is our culture, how we're shaped with our families, our local church, our life experience, our ministry. That's our clay jar. Our clay jar, that's the image I'm using. That's the clay jar that we all have. And within each of those clay jars, whatever culture or background we come from, that jars take different shapes. Within that is God's grace. So in the work we'll be talking about today on interculturality, which I'll define, it talks about how do we acknowledge God's presence in each individual earthen jar, how we're each shaped in that way. And earthen jar, whether we're in a prison, that how our earthen jar is shaped by our situation and life experience there. So as we begin here, we give thanks for the treasure of God's grace in our own earthen jar, how that was shaped, and also the gift of the earthen jar of other people, and how God's grace is coming. So in interculturality, we're going to be talking about how to appreciate more God's presence in the various shapes of earthen jars that we encounter, people of difference. And I know that as you are coming in today, you bring a lot of your own life experience with you already. We're all adults. We have life experience of doing this. So I just encourage you to take whatever I'm saying today, whatever might be helpful, and just take it. What's the next step for you? And acknowledging differences, appreciating differences, respecting differences. And I mean, I keep running into differences all the time. I'll be 72 next week, and I keep running into new differences all the time with different areas in that way. Able, disabled peoples, that's been something of the last 18 months to be aware of that us-them category. So just whatever, I encourage any of you just to take your own context, your own experience, and just take it whatever the next step is. Okay? So what I'll be doing today, the first talk, introduction and entering someone else's garden, that's an imagery that I use. We have a break. Healing Mass, I understand, will be 11 to 11:30, followed by lunch, and then a second session this afternoon for those of you that can stay. In that session, we'll be looking at the intercultural journey of Jesus. And that might be a little surprise for you. What was the journey that Jesus went through? Being born in his own Jewish context, but he had to reach out beyond his own categories of how he was raised through table fellowship and other ways. And then the early church as well. Okay, so then we get more into the scriptural background of that and the early church, and then for ourselves too. There I have an image of John Paul II when he came. I forget what year he came here. Was that 2006? At least the statement came out in 2006. I don't know what. 86? Oh, 86. Okay. The book came out later. Okay, so I'm just going to begin by defining culture, and this may seem rather simple, but I want to make sure, because the understanding of culture, sometimes people think of culture in a very narrow sense, but the way we're talking about it today is understanding culture in a very broad sense, not just ethnicity and race. Okay, now originally, culture was understood in a more of a classicist way, in a way that my culture, whatever that I was raised in, was the norm and a permanent one. Also, this is during colonial times where the West is the best. And there was prejudice against non-Western cultures. This goes back to the colonial times. That's sort of a classicist, older understanding of culture. Culture is only by a certain number of people. Today we move to what is called an empiricist perspective, in which we say every people has a culture, a legitimate way of life. Every culture is legitimate for the people. No culture is normative. In other words, I can't use any culture as the norm to judge other people. But we're born with a culture. We'll talk about that. Okay? So no culture is better than the other. Okay. So if we look in terms of the modern understanding of culture, this is 20th century, first part of the 20th century. This was the understanding of culture I had when I first went to Papua New Guinea in 1975. I was a seminarian then, 24 years old. And when I talk about culture in Chicago, the three words, simple words, there's many definitions, try to keep it simple here. I talk about meaning, identity, and order. So this is what every culture needs to do. It needs to help people to find out what gives meaning in life, in their culture, what's their identity, who they are, and order. In other words, to avoid chaos. Culture has to tell us which side of the road are you going to drive on. U.S. on the right, Australia on the left. So in other words, we need to have order. Culture has to do this, because people can't stand to live in chaos. There has to be some order to things in that way. So the modern understanding of culture is that culture is one sort of understanding, and it used to be understood, not exactly today, that it was sort of static. So when I went to Papua New Guinea the first time in 75, I walked into the village and I said, oh, this is the culture for everybody. Everybody understands it. It all fits together. We know that's not true, but in those days, that's how we understood it. Cultures were sort of fixed. You walked into a certain place, it was like this. Clear boundaries. And the stress there was on the order within the culture. Okay? That way. So what this is an image of, I don't know what you call them in Australia, jigsaw puzzles where you put the pieces together. Is that what you call it here? Jigsaw puzzles, okay. I know there's differences in language between the U.S. and Australia. So jigsaw puzzle. So these are two images of jigsaw puzzles. So in other words, the understanding was that everything fit together all the pieces fit together nicely, okay. So if I came from this jigsaw puzzle and I go to do that one, can I take a piece from here and just automatically fit it in over there? No, it's not going to fit. The only way it'll fit if you take a scissors or something like that to make it fit. So when I grew up in the culture I grew up in a county in the state of Ohio, and the county I grew up in was 95% German-American Catholic farmers. County north of me was 95% German-American Protestant farmers. So the Lutherans lived up there and the Catholics lived here. And that's just the way it was in those days. When they moved over, they brought their divisions from Europe and they lived separately in that way. So I grew up in a very particular, my dad was a farmer, never went to high school, just a farmer. I was the eldest son, so I had my share of helping out with the chores when I was in second grade and things like that. So anyways, so in my culture, in my jigsaw puzzle, I had certain understandings of how things were to be. When I went to then a jigsaw puzzle, if I use that term, in Papua New Guinea, things were different there. So I had to adjust. So for example, in my home culture, when people were thinking about marriage, they had times for dating and things like that, individuals that they would meet. And the decision for marriage was basically between two individuals. And they would like the family to like them, but it was basically between two individuals. We call that individual-centric societies. Papua New Guinea, their marriage is between communities and families. They would never think of getting married. The marriage is between two clans or families, at least traditionally and pretty much still today. And this is not just Papua New Guinea, in other places too. The importance of the family. So it's really families getting together in that way. So when I went to New Guinea, I had to realize that the understanding of marriage is different. And the different understanding of marriage impacts economics, and impacts order, it impacts raising children, all these things like that. Okay. So when we move from one culture to another, and again, culture in a broad sense, we need to realize what our jigsaw puzzle looks like, but realize that the pieces don't fit. In New Guinea, I had to make many adjustments to understand. Okay? All right. So now, what we call the postmodern understanding of culture is we realize that cultures aren't exactly all that, it's not all complete good order inside of a culture. Because there's different diversity within the culture, huh? There's different things between how people in the culture experience it. And culture is changing. So when I went back to Papua New Guinea to the villages, and I went back again, and last time I was there was 2002, first time in 75. 2002, there were a lot of changes in the village. People think the villages don't change, but they change. Now people have the cell phones, and the girls are dressing differently than they did before, and things like that. And there are changes. And society changes, and they're fluid. So now when we talk about culture, yes, we do talk about ethnicity and race. That is part of the culture. That is one way, but it's much more than that. And then social location. So how the rich experience culture and the poor is very, very different. We see this in cities around the world. Unfortunately, you can see the tremendous differences in that way. Women and men experience culture in a very different way. How they experience it and express it is different. Male and female. If you come from the country or come from the cities, very different. I grew up in the country. Then I moved to Chicago. Very, very different. Very, very different. How people greet each other, how they live, what they do with their neighbors. It's just social values are very different in that way. So there's a lot of social location, where people are at. I deal a lot with theological perspectives where I teach. People have very different theological perspectives. Like in the U.S., we have almost a polarity now in the Catholic Church. So that's also in a diversity. I don't know what it's like in Australia. But again, these are all the us-them categories that we have. Okay? And then social change is always going on. So you can, when I go back into the village after 20 years, it's very different. It's very different. Now, there are some things that are similar. The culture doesn't change completely, but it has to adjust to change. What social media has done now in our world is it changes our culture, very much, in ways that affects relationships. COVID, how has it affected all of us, and things like that. And then there are particular individual and communal situations also. So, for example, I'm the oldest of 11. My youngest brother is 22 years younger than me. So his experience of culture is very different. He could be my son. So that's generational differences, which is another us-them category in that way. So how we experience them in different ways. Am I talking too fast? We're okay here? Okay. I was in the Philippines for 3 weeks, and I had to slow down there because a number of people had only studied English for 4 months. So I had to slow down. So please, if you can't understand something or words I'm using, please just let me know, okay? So one of the images we use for culture is an iceberg. So for an iceberg, 15% is above the water level, 85% below the water level. So if you think in terms of culture, what's above the water level are the things we can see. Language, how people dress, what people eat. That's what you can see. But that's all based on what's below the water level. That's the worldview of values, your understanding of justice, raising kids, all those values that are there, your understanding of authority, relationships, that's all below. So when we talk about interculturality, we start on the level above the water level. That's where you start. Language, dress, food. I know it's hard to read all of this, Later on, you can share this, maybe a PowerPoint or something. I don't know. You can do what you want. I can share the PowerPoint later. I know it's hard to read the small words, But I think you get the sense of what I'm talking about, Yeah. So the challenge when we talk in terms of interculturality is how do we talk from one iceberg to another? In other words, dealing on the surface level is one thing, but then the challenge, interculturality this is not easy. This is very, very challenging. How do we understand the people's worldview from their perspective? From their perspective. And this takes a long time, and we never get it perfect, in that way. So now I'm going to continue with defining some terms. I'm taking these terms from Anthony Gittins. He's born in Britain. A colleague of mine, he just died about a month ago. He was a missionary in Sierra Leone, anthropologist, taught with me, did a lot of work. We worked a lot together. There's a book here called Living Mission Interculturally. It's, I think, one of the best books more on interculturality. And it's just been translated into Spanish, which maybe doesn't make a lot of sense here, but in the U.S., that's a big deal to have it in Spanish now, too. So he's a great friend of mine. When I see Tony, I think of him. He just died he died at home in England, actually, just by, that's where he was when he died. So this is a book from him. So these are from a little bit there. So first of all, monocultural living is a homogeneous. So in a way, that's how I grew up. I grew up in a county that 95% German-American farmers, Catholics. So it was very homogeneous. Now there was different generations and all of that, but still I didn't really know much about the other world. Even crossing over to, back in those days, I was told not even to drive past a Protestant church, go around the block. And in a country, a block is a mile square, so drive around the block is different than in the city. So my world would, of course, expand. Ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism, the way I'm using it here, I'm using it in a way that, yes, we regard and respect our own culture, that's important, but if we use that as the lens, so my glasses here, if we use our culture to judge others, that's where we get into trouble, We're using our lens to judge others, So the idea is that so if you're living in a monocultural way, you try to avoid contact with others. I wouldn't even go near those Protestants in those days. Now I teach Protestants and I work with Protestants all the time, Yeah. Another term that's used is international or multicultural. That means that this is just the mere presence of people of different cultures. When I fly out of the airports, people are of different cultures, but we don't necessarily talk to each other or, anything like that. So basically you're trying to eliminate as much difference as possible, tolerate it, manage it. You're in an airport, different cultures, okay, this is where you stand, this is where you get your tickets. This is what you do. And we need that order. You need to have some order like that, But tolerance is, basically the goal is to tolerate or just manage the difference. Now, as Christians, tolerance can be a trap. Because if you say all we want to do is tolerate one another, if that's all we're going to do, we got to do much more than that. We come into the room today, and many of you know each other already. So, we're beyond the tolerations here. Now, it'd be great in different parts of the world, and in Afghanistan and other places, if they would tolerate each other. That would be wonderful if they did. But so in some parts of the world, toleration would be great. But for we as Christians, we're looking beyond that. Not just tolerating our differences, trying to get by. So the next term is cross-cultural living. So this is now we commit ourselves to going to another culture. And probably all of us in this room have done that. Committed ourselves one way or another. And again, culture understood in a broad sense. Going into a prison, hospital, these are all different contexts. So to learn the other culture. Adaptation. So that means you're focusing in on the upper part of the iceberg. So I go to Papua New Guinea, language school. Then I go to learn to live in the village. The foods, dealing with malaria. Those are surface level. I'm not saying they're not challenging, but they're, and learning languages, as many of us know, is very, very challenging. Becoming a child again. So this is good. So we identify with, accepted by another culture, but we're always an outsider. I go to Papua New Guinea. I was only there 6 years, but I could be there for 46 years. I'm still an outsider. We're always an outsider. We never become the other. Yeah. So here the goal is assimilation, accommodation, and this is common for those of us serving in mission and ministry. And this is a good thing. But the focus here is basically going one way. How do I accommodate to the other? Okay. Now, intercultural. Here we have someone else coming in. Okay. We have a nice seat in the front row here. Oh, he's got a back row seat. Okay, that's okay too. Good, welcome. So intercultural is Intentional engagement of the difference for the sake of understanding and enrichment. So this is where we say we want to have a mutual exchange between others, that we are enriched by the others and also challenged by the others. So it requires to be tolerant of ambiguity. You see the image there is taken from your church, huh? Beautiful image from the church there, huh? So openness to change, a balanced relationship, which means we have to acknowledge our prejudices, and we all have them. We'll have them with us all the time. We always have prejudgments, huh? Now, do we act on those prejudgments? That's a different story. But we have them. When I walk down the street in Chicago, I still try to be attentive. Depend who's walking towards me. I already have prejudgments in my head. I just need to acknowledge them. Not that I judge people, but to know how I behave. Do I clutch my jacket a little closer because I'm afraid or something like that? Huh? So just to acknowledge it. The goal here is this big word, interculturality, which I equate with the reign of God. Because God is calling us to live together as God's family, brothers and sisters together. Huh? So interculturality is a religious value. So in terms of just a summary, homogeneous is one single culture, although today that's very hard to find one single culture anymore. International is the mere fact of having people of different cultures together. Sometimes my SVD confreres will say, oh yes, we're international, we're intercultural, and it's like, those are two different things. Yeah, by birth we have different color passports, not by birth, but we have different color passports. But intercultural is going much deeper. Relationships of mutual enrichment in the depth of who we are. Huh? Cross-cultural is moving in one direction. Again, it's a good thing. But now the challenge, I think, for us is to think about mutually enriching and challenging relationships with others. Okay? Ethnocentrism I already defined, if we use our culture to judge others. So using these two images here, if you imagine the upper image on the right is sort of our classes that we're sort of born with from our culture. And interculturality is saying, put on God's glasses. Huh? How does God see other people? He doesn't see them as being less human or more valuable. No, in that way. Huh? My youngest nephew is autistic. God looks on him with the same human value that he looks on me with a doctorate degree. Huh? So how do we look at people with God's glasses? Huh? And this is an ongoing, lifelong process. Huh? The term this is an image taken from Tony Gittins, and this is, he talks about ABCD as 4 different cultures, for example, whatever those cultures might be. So interculturality means that how do we get mutually enriched and challenged between the ABCD, but for the sake of the E. So what's the E? So for example here, the E is the parish. Huh? People of different cultures, of different communities that come together. So how are you mutually enriched and challenged by each other? But then for the sake of the E, God's mission. Huh? Now you could think in just human terms. Business people do this, that's fine. But we're talking about for the sake of God's mission, how do we create that common community of diversity? Huh? And this it's challenging, I know. Yeah. We have a lot of multicultural parishes in the United States, Catholic parishes. A lot of English and Spanish bilingual parishes. Huh? I know in Australia too, certainly here is very multicultural, I know that. Yeah. So this is the challenge that we have. And interculturality is a religious value. Huh? The meaning of interculturality, this is from my colleague Bob Casala. He was in leadership in our congregational leadership team for 2 terms. He's now in Japan. He got his doctorate degree in Japan. He's now president of our university, Nansan University in Japan. He's a sociologist. Huh? So as he wrote, interculturality beyond mere coexistence, so beyond that, to emphasize and make more explicit the essential mutuality, that's the big word, the process of cultural interaction on a personal level and a social level. Huh? Why? For the sake of God's mission. Huh? From God back to God. So as we return to God, God created us in God's image. Huh? All peoples, all creation. How are we now called back to God? Huh? How are we called back? This is both within our religious life or family life, whatever you interpret that as you need to. and also within our own ministry that we do. So ad intra and ad extra. Okay? Okay. Are we okay so far here? Everything okay? Okay. All right. So, as we move on from here, and this question of interculturality is a burning issue around the world. Certainly within the church, within the religious congregations, within any form of ministry that we're doing, how do we engage the other in a respectful way? And in our world, of course, this is so demanding. Huh? I work with a lot of religious communities from around the world. A lot of men and women's communities. I worked with a lot, but I have a full-time job too, so I can only do so much. There's somebody else coming behind you, huh? Are we okay, Prakash? Okay, I saw you making a motion with your hand. Oh, told her to go around. Okay, good. So welcome. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So we've been talking about interculturality, which means how can we be mutually enriched by people that are different than us. Different than us in terms of our culture, also our gender, our age, our economic background, whatever those us-them categories are. Huh? So it's much broader than just ethnicity. So now I'm just going to move now to this image that I use here, entering someone else's garden. This is an image that I've used in the past, and some of you may know it from other readings that you've read of mine. I don't know. It's an image. I think you had it in seminary? No, you did. Oh, that's it. I know we were talking about this yesterday in the car. He had it down in YTU in Melbourne. They used some of my writing down there when he studied theology there. Okay. So this image. So I grew up on a farm, as I mentioned. So I knew what soil felt like in my hands and things like that. Now, when I went to Papua New Guinea, I worked with people who were subsistence farmers. Huh? They got their food from the gardens. It's not a cash economy. A family maybe made $100 a year selling some coffee. So it's not a cash economy. So they depended on their garden. So they were definitely agriculturalists. Huh? And they depend on living from that. If the pigs got in and destroyed it, they'd have to go to the forest to find something. Huh? And I was, luckily, I grew up in a situation of agriculture, so for me that was not so difficult. Of course, they farm very differently in there. And also, if we connect with Jesus, and this afternoon we'll talk more about Jesus and that in interculturality, but just now, he had 3 parables, agricultural parables, that he used. One was the sower and the seed. I have an image here, an African image in the seed of that parable. Sowing the seed, it lands in good soil or in a path or in weeds. Huh? Darnell by the enemy, the farmer sleeping at night, weeds are coming up. So in other words, weeds are going to come. There are the weeds in a garden too. Gardens are not just good seed. They also have weeds. And also while the farmer sleeps, the good seed grows on its own. The Word of God has a power of its own. It doesn't depend on us being awake. Huh? God's seed grows on its own. So there's both that. Huh? Now the early, when I teach in Chicago, I teach courses on this, so then I go into more details of theology and everything. Just to keep it brief here today. In the early church, people called apologists. These were like early theologians, very early. Justus Martyr, he grew up in Alexandria. It was the second largest city in the Roman Empire and a very intellectual center, philosophical center. He was a philosopher when he grew up, and he was looking for God. He was looking for meaning in life. And when he found Christianity, he said, this is what I was looking for in philosophy. Huh? So he found a connection between the philosophy that he was studying and what Christianity had to offer. So he used some philosophical terms called logos. It's rational being. It's all of us share in this. He came from philosophy, and he said Jesus was the logos, the Word. So in John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word. The beginning was the logos. So in other words, he used his background to make a connection with the Christian faith. Huh? So he saw a continuity between his culture, philosophy, and a Christian faith. Tertullian grew up in a different context in the Roman Empire. He was in North Africa, which was very part of the Roman Empire then, south of the Mediterranean Sea. And he lived in a situation where Christians were being persecuted. They were being killed for their faith. So he's saying, this culture is bad. This is not a good place for us, huh? And so they suffered. So he took a more negative view of the relationship between the context of his culture and the Christian faith. Now I think nowadays what we do, and Vatican II quoted from both of these patristic writers. Vatican II included Justin Martyr and Tertullian. So I think now we talk about every culture has both good seed and weeds, like a garden. As far as I know, I don't know of any garden without some weeds. Maybe you are experts, I don't know. But good seeds and weeds. So every culture has the good seed of God's word, how God has been stirring amongst all peoples and drawing them. And there's also the weeds. Good seed while the farmer sleeps, the weeds while the farmer sleeps. So every culture, there's no Christian culture. Every culture, human-made culture, has both good seeds and weeds. My culture, good seeds and weeds. And in the past, missionaries sometimes would go to places and they'd go and all they see is weeds, right? So what would they do? Pull them out. And then what do they plant? Seeds from their home. And for some reason, they didn't grow well in the tropics, they planted. So that was the image of those days. But we've moved way beyond that, of course, in Vatican II and that, and I don't have time to go through all that today. But, to recognize that God, the good seed of God's word in all cultures. And there are also the weeds. So again, it's a both and. Same way in interculturality. We have those earthen jars, but those earthen jars sometimes have cracks too, and blemishes. They're not perfect. So we value our earthen jars, but recognize that they're also earthen of earth. So the need for conversion. And I'll talk more about that later. So how do we enter someone else's garden? So you understand, I'm using garden as in a metaphorical way, like a parable, okay? When I taught in the Philippines, for those who are not learning English know so well, it took a while. They thought I was talking about making gardens. Then I explained, no, that's just it's a parable I'm talking about, worldview. Okay? So, how do we understand our own culture? So this is a picture of me when I grew up, taking care of the pigs. After second grade, get off the school bus. That was my job, to feed the pigs. Okay? So that's me there. Yeah. So, social location. We need to know where we're coming from. Our gender does make a difference, obviously. How we approach others. And this has been a learning process, continues to be for me. As a celibate, as I work more and more with women, and all of that. What's the difference of the women's world, men's world, in different cultures, of course. Papua New Guinea, women's and men's worlds are very different also. So why do we do that? Economic class, generation, our nationality. My blue passport from the U.S., that has an impact when I go to other countries, whether I want to or not, because of what's associated with that. So the nationality is a part of our identity. Ethnicity and race. I grew up in a German-American context. My grandmother spoke Plattdeutsch. It's a dialect of German. My father's mother. Social change, we talked about, in my own particular individual and communal circumstances. So when I'm working with students who are preparing, I'm talking adults, graduate school, who are going to work out in other countries or other cultures in their own country, we always talk a lot about you need to know your own culture, your own garden. Usually my experience has been, I learned my own culture when I left it. Because when I lived in it, I'm like a fish in water. So everything is there. The water is water. There's nothing else. But when you go to another culture, you realize that people live differently and legitimately in good ways like that. But then I began to reflect back and say, Papua New Guinea, marriage is between families. In my culture it's different. Why? Then, you begin to understand below the ice level, the iceberg on the top, you go below the water level to understand what's going on. And it's very important to understand this when you work with other people, because if you don't know your own world, then you're going to see conflicts that maybe don't really exist, because the values may be the same, but how do you express them? So there are seeds and weeds in my own garden, and God's life is in my earthen jars. So it's both. Why do I enter someone else's garden? I know you probably can't see this picture here where some of your sisters are pictured on there. Are some of you on there? I can't tell. Huh? Can you see them? Maybe you have to come up closer later and look at the picture. Anyways, I went on Google, tried to find pictures from here, so I hope that, I don't know. Maybe I'm in the wrong place. Huh? Huh? You know those people, huh? Okay. So why do you enter someone else's garden? And I know we're in different places here. We come from different countries and different ministries. But why do we enter someone else's garden? Why do we go to work in a prison? Why do we do this? You know, whatever that different world is. Huh? So this is from a colleague of mine, Claude Marie Barbour. She's a French Presbyterian minister. She worked in South Africa during apartheid. She broke the rules of blacks living with whites, so she ended up in prison and tortured. Huh? But she then came to the States and became my teacher and mentor. I've learned a lot from Claude Marie. She's still living. She's around 90 years old now and can't get around physically too well. But anyways, dear, she wrote this. When ministry, and define ministry in your own way, or whatever that means, is seen as dialogical, mutual exchange, it means that the ministers become persons immersed in the world of the others, like Jesus was in our world, incarnation. It is with people, therefore, that the ministers begin to ask questions. It is with people that basic human values are endorsed, good seeds of the word, and challenged, the weeds. Huh? It is in this context that shapes the announcing of the good news, the good seed, and denouncing sinful structures, the weeds. So again, this interculturality, cultural level, understanding the world of the other like the iceberg. On a religious level, what are the values of the reign of God? So in the way we're looking at two, but they're happening at the same time, huh? You know what I mean? So culturally, how do we identify and understand another culture? But then we also have our Christian values that applies to our culture and that of others. So how do we begin to enter someone else's garden? The one image I use here is that of taking off one's shoes. So when I go to visit a Vietnamese family in the States, I see the shoes outside the door and I know what to do. I take my shoes off so I don't bring my dirt or the dirt of the street into somebody's home. It's a sign of respect. You go to a mosque, you leave your shoes outside the door, huh? Out of respect. So again, this is just an image. Huh? So Tony Gittins here, my former colleague of late memory. If a newcomer honestly presents herself or himself as a stranger, showing respect for the host and allowing them to take certain necessary initiatives. So you go into somebody's home, you don't tell them to move their pictures around on the wall or do something. No. You're a stranger. I didn't say strange, stranger. In other words, it's good because it puts us in a position of learning and being in somebody else's space. The price can be uncertainty and powerlessness on the part of the stranger because you walk in, you don't know where to sit, what to stand, what to say, who to talk to, who do you talk first, all those things like that, huh? But it's only by doing this that missionaries, ministers are able to indicate their openness, their integrity, their willingness to engage in a relationship, huh? So being a stranger can be a good thing because it puts us, when I went to Papua New Guinea, I was a stranger for sure. Yeah. So we need to learn to be like a child again, huh? In the garden of the other. So I go to Papua New Guinea, I've already got a year of graduate studies behind me. That little 5-year-old knows the language better than me. Huh? So becoming a child again, especially language learning, I know is, I live in a community in which English is the second language for almost everybody in that community. And I know the challenges of learning another language. Huh? I mean, I've had to learn languages too. Yeah, in Papua New Guinea, Rome, other places, yeah. Anyways, the importance of mentors. When we go to a new place, it's important to have people who can mentor us into that. When I went to Papua New Guinea, I had Pat Gesh, he's from Townsville. SVD still in Papua New Guinea. He was my pastor when I was a seminarian. He was very engaged in anthropology, learning local languages, so he's a great mentor for me to help me to enter into the culture and make the connection between Papua New Guinea culture and the Christian faith. He also gave me a Papua New Guinea mentor. His name was Benjamin Wakwanje. He's a grade 12 graduate. In those days in Papua New Guinea, grade 12 graduates were probably 1 out of 10,000. I was there back in '75 when Western education was new. So Benjamin Wakwanje, he was my guide for my first 2 weeks in the village. So he showed me where to go. I went with the men in the morning to work in the gardens. I was a seminarian at the time. He was the one. I made mistakes. I won't tell you about my mistakes. But anyways, I made some bad mistakes. But he was there to explain to me what I had done. Yeah. This applies to all of us, I think. When we go to a new place, how do we understand the situation? When I first came back to the States, I was living with Vietnamese for the first time, so I didn't know the Vietnamese culture. I became rector after 3 months because the former rector died 11 days after being appointed. So that wasn't good. I'd been out of the country for 10 years. I came back to a new place, then I became rector in 3 months. It's not a smart way to start, And then I had the Vietnamese guys there. I wasn't used to that when I was in formation. So I would be sitting in a chair and they'd be sitting there and they'd be looking down the ground, And I'd say, why don't they respect me? Why don't they look at me in the eyes? Why don't they, look at me? Are they dishonest? Are they hiding things, Because that's my interpretation. So I'm using my lens, because in my lens it says if you respect somebody, you look at them eye to eye. So then I had a mentor. I found a Vietnamese woman who had been religious. She'd been in religious life. She left religious life. She grew up in Vietnam. Then she moved to the States. So she knew both worlds. So she explained to me, says, Roger, they are showing you respect. In their culture, by not looking directly in the eye, they're showing you respect. So both of us were showing respect, but in different ways. So our basic values were all there. Now that's a simple example, but see, I was judging. I was thinking, is that student lying or hiding something? Why aren't they looking at me? Again, I was making judgments. That's where the ethnocentrism is dangerous. You judge others according to my lens. So, and she taught me many things. And I came to her for many advice. Now we have other Vietnamese SVDs, of course, who are working there. But in that day, that was at the beginning. Quang Duc Dinh, he was our outgoing formation. He was a student when I was there, seminarian. He got ordained in '92. Anyways, sorry, I get distracted with stories. Okay, so we make mistakes, identify our own prejudices, and there are seeds and weeds in both cultures. Okay. Now, what do I do in someone else's garden? So, ideally, unless we're walking into a war zone, ideally we start out with an attitude of dialogue, taking off our shoes out of respect for the people. Again, we don't need passports to do this. We can do this right when we walk in a hospital room, when we go into a prison, anything we do. Okay. However, sometimes we do have to take a prophetic stance too, depending on where we're at. I'll give you just a couple examples from my experience in Papua New Guinea. When I saw how they took care of the elders and the weak, those who were mentally disabled and that, they took care of them in a very strong way. A very strong respect for elders. Very, very strong. And I had to think back to my culture and think, sometimes we don't do this very well between generations and that. So, and there are more things too. There are other things though that they themselves identified, and they said, this is a weed in our garden. Sorcery. And I won't go into the details of what sorcery is. It's very complicated. It's where you use something belonging to somebody else to cause them to get sick. And they came to me and said, Father, sorcery is an evil. It's a weed in our garden. We can't trust our neighbors. So they identified that as a weed. So how do I accompany them in that process? However, on another occasion, I was driving. This is after I went back a second time after ordination. I was pastor in the parish. And I drove around the corner, and a man was beating his wife with a stick. And I stopped the car and got out and walked over there between them and talked to them. Okay. Now I put the stick down. Okay. Now I get in the car. I drive around the corner. What happens when I turn the corner? I don't know. Yeah, he may pick up the stick again. I don't know what happens. But then a month later, we had a parish board meeting, and I talked to them about what's about domestic violence in your culture. Because some say it's not domestic violence, it's the man's right, Again, this is part of the weeds in the culture. Now, I had that same weed in my culture. I have domestic violence in my culture too. The only difference is, in the U.S., you do it behind closed doors. In Papua New Guinea, you do it in public. So, you got the weeds both ways, So I'm not blaming them, but I cannot. Anytime I saw it, I could not stand. I could not. I couldn't. I had to do something. So I would go and I would try to come between. But then the bigger story is, for the people, they got to deal with their own weeds in their own garden. It's their garden, not mine. But what's my role in that case? So again, some things we identify with, and being prophetic, you have to be careful, because sometimes you might see something that's bad in the culture, which really isn't so bad. But to me, there are some things that are. Yeah. Suicide of young people. This is not a good thing. Okay. And then what I ended up doing was we had male initiation happening in Papua New Guinea. They also had female initiation, but of course I could not enter the women's world. The men's world and the women's world are both sacred in Papua New Guinea. So the women's initiation, that was not a world I could enter into. But the men's initiation was a world in which, and the people at that time were sort of restarting up the initiation, and they were talking with each other and saying, what are the good seeds in this initiation? What are the good things? It helps to teach respect for elders. It helps us to teach us how to be mature spouses. It teaches us how to behave properly, how to get reconciliation when there's conflict. But they also said there are weeds in our traditional initiation. In the past, some of the young people would die because of the severe cuttings and things like that. And there were other aspects. So they'd say, what are the seeds and the weeds in our traditional initiation? So I eventually accompanied them in that discernment in what that was about, in that way. Later on, we also said, okay, how do we do our traditional initiation as Christians? Because they were all Catholics in that area. How do we do this? And then later on, we got to talk about how do we do Christian initiation as Papua New Guineans? So how do we include those aspects of our culture that help us to celebrate initiation? So we did a nice confirmation. Took us a year to prepare for it, talking with people to say, what are those aspects of culture? And that's not me as an outsider. For them, what are those things of their culture that helps them to express and experience their Christian faith? So we did sort of what we'd call an inculturated, sort of connecting with their own cultures, and we did that. Again, there was a Mercy sister from Townsville. She had worked with the women. She knew women initiation. She'd studied. So I asked her to come over from the neighboring parish. She would sit with the women elders, the women catechists, the women teachers, the women nurses, and they would go through a whole year of discerning what are the things of their own initiation that are good Christian values and those things that are not. Then how do we do that in terms of the Christian way? That's a whole other talk. But just to say that sometimes in the process we find ourselves maybe walking with people in that discernment process in our own society. And I'm not just talking about people in Papua New Guinea or other parts of the world. This applies to my own white U.S. culture. No, U.S. is not white culture, but in my culture in the United States, and our culture here. What are those things of our culture that are good seeds, but what are the weeds? And then, in our Christian faith, how do we bring our culture into that in a healthy way? Okay. What happens to our own garden? My life has changed because of Papua New Guinea. My students get tired of hearing Papua New Guinea stories. But I mean, it was very formative years for me. I was 24 the first time I went. And I learned a lot in that way, which again, since then I've been involved in many other things. And I was challenged in Papua New Guinea. I was challenged. I was working and living with first, second generation Christians. And when I saw the decisions they had to make, in the parish there were traditional enemies, 2 different languages groups. And now they're told to be of one parish. I said, oh, being a Christian is pretty demanding. And they still have memories of being beat up by their fellows across the ridge. So that made me think, I took things for granted as a Christian. Vincent Donovan's book, who was talking, we were talking about, I used Vincent Donovan. So Vincent Donovan was he died now. I also knew him personally. He, Spiritan priest, worked with the Maasai people in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya area. They're cattle herders. At the beginning, when he started his ministry, he worked in more of a traditional mission station. People would come there. But he says, I need to go out there. These are cattle herders. They're not coming into the mission station. So he went out with the Maasai, and he ended up accompanying them and spending time with them, traveling with them, as they were herding their cattle and things like that. And eventually, some of them would say, "Can you tell us about your God?" So then he would start talking about that, and in a way that was appropriate in their culture, explaining who Jesus was and the good news. And after a month or so, or whatever, sometimes people would say, "Oh, tell us more." Then he would tell them more. Then eventually baptisms. But there are others, he would spend the time, he would tell them, and afterwards they said, "Thank you, but no thank you." He shared his word. That's our responsibility. Everybody has an open conscience of how they respond, right? And then he said, "No, not now." And they said, "Okay." So he did what he had to do. That's the challenge that we have, huh? So Vincent Dunneman talked about how he rediscovered his Christianity. And I could give many other examples. The book is full of beautiful examples of how he was enriched by his time like that. And I could tell you stories about, for myself in Papua New Guinea and that. Even like with my nieces and nephews. So I'm from a big family, 34 nieces and nephews. And so with each of them too, that's like that's a different generation for me. So how is God stirring in their lives? Some of them are very much engaged in the church and very committed. Unbelievable. One of my nieces has been working in West Africa for 6 years. Other ones, church is like, "Oh, that's boring, and it's not relevant." But God is still in their life. So then, I may not use God language with them, but I'll just say, "What are you thinking about doing into your life? What are you hoping for?" Things like that, So how do we engage people different than ourselves in a way that we can connect? And then in terms of, for those of you in religious communities, and I do a lot of this work, how does people of different cultures, how does that impact who we are? It shapes our that E in the middle there, who we are as religious communities. And that'd be true of the religious communities that are in this room here. You may have particular reflections on this later. I'm ready to finish here in a little bit. So just in conclusion, Jerry Arbuckle, some of you may know him. He's a New Zealander anthropologist. I think he's a Marist, Marist, yeah. And he's done a lot of writing in religious life and things like that. Wonderful writer, Yeah. And he certainly, I've had a chance to meet him as well, and he's just a wonderful human being, yeah. And he talks about 3 stages when we engage people of different backgrounds, He said the first stage is we're fascinated by the differences. That's the honeymoon stage. "Oh yes, this is so nice. Oh, this is so good. Different people moving, clothes. We're fascinated." But then after some time, we sort of go, "Ooh, I don't like these differences. Why don't they do it like we do it? Like they're supposed to do it, the way we do it." So he said the temptation is to take a step back and have a common meal together and enjoy the food and stuff like that. But he said what we're challenged to do is to take a step forward and to really engage the differences in a mutually respectful way. It involves some compromise and things like that, but how do we do that? How do we do that? So with interculturality, we're talking about identifying the difference. Yes, we are different. No, we're all God's children, yes, for sure. But yet we're all different also. Personality is another issue. Personality and culture is that's a whole other talk, Yeah, there's differences that way. We engage the difference, we identify it, but then we're willing to engage the difference and say, "Let's talk about it." This doesn't happen easy. There has to be trust. And dialogue means both sides are willing. If it only goes one direction, it's monologue. And often that's the way life is, Because being able to enter. So when I first went to the reservations, I've been going to the Lakota reservations. It's one of the indigenous groups in the United States. And I've been going there for 33 years now. I take students there and that. And when I first went there, it was challenging because you're a white guy. Look what the U.S. government has done to us, broken treaties, giving us smallpox by the gift of blankets. I guess in Australia they also had a version of that too. That was done through, through flour? I think through flour. That's what I heard. Yeah, arsenic was given through flour. I heard that last night. In the U.S., smallpox through blankets, that was given. So the genocide, what happened? So when I arrived there, they say, "Okay, we know we know who you are." So it takes a while. So I had to sort of sit there and absorb some anger sometimes, anger for the past. But then with time, now I've gotten very good relationships with people, and I'm enriched by them, and they're enriched by me. But it's taken time to build that relationship of trust, and they trust me to bring other people there. Huh? So that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so this is the end of my time. It went longer than I planned.